Hi everybody, thank you for your patience. Welcome to this event, Mass Incarceration in El Salvador, State of Exception, State of Repression. Thanks to everybody who came out in person and those of you joining us online. This event will feature a panel discussion and then a question and answer Q&A session. After the conclusion of the Q&A, we'd like to invite those of you who are here in person to socialize and informally continue the discussion over some refreshments. So if you have time, please stick around. I will be introducing our speakers in just a moment. First, I think I've already said this, but as you're probably aware, this is a hybrid event. We've got people online and in person. And components of the event are in both English and Spanish. And so if you have not yet, if you need translation, you can get a headset from the corner in this room. And for those of us joining online, you should be able to access the audio translation by clicking on the interpretation globe icon at the bottom of your screen and select the language channel that you want. At least that is what the AI overview said when I asked Google how to do that. My name is Jordan House. I will be emceeing the event tonight. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Labor Studies at Brock University. I've been involved in the Canadian prisoners' justice movement for many years. And one of my main areas of academic work is on prison labor in Canada. And while I've followed some of the developments in El Salvador, I have no particular expertise in today's topic and discussion, and I'm very much looking forward to learning from our panelists. Before we get to the panel, I've got some acknowledgements and thank yous to run through. While this event is online, we would like to acknowledge that those of us who are gathered in Toronto are on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Chippewa, and Mississaugas of the Credit. We also, at the Leo Panish School, believe that it is important to recognize the ways in which capitalism relies on prejudice, exploitation, and oppression to keep Indigenous and non-Indigenous working people divided. The Leo Panish School for Socialist Education was founded in 2023 by members of the Socialist Project, an eco-socialist organization in Toronto. We strive to provide radical, accessible, and practical educational programming to those seeking to better understand and address the crises of our current times. This event was co-organized with solidarity with the victims of the state of exception in El Salvador, and has also been supported by York University's Center for Research on Latin America and the Caribbean, the Comité pour les droits humains en Amérique latine, excuse my French, as well as the Department of Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin American Studies at the University of Toronto. Also, major thank you to our translator, Ana Ragumas, who I'll fully introduce in a moment. And also I want to say thank you to Matt Davis on the ones and the twos, who's helping us with the technical side and is the coordinator for the Leo Panish School and all the other volunteers at the event today. As some of you might be aware, today is August 10th, which is International Prisoners' Justice Day, an international day of mourning, protest, and activism, and so it's a very fitting day for this discussion on mass incarceration in El Salvador. And while our panelists will discuss the details of the situation in El Salvador, I'd like to briefly take a moment to say something about Prisoner Justice Day. The first Prisoner Justice Day was observed in 1975 on the one-year anniversary of the death of a prisoner named Eddie Nolan, who died by suicide while incarcerated at Millhaven Penitentiary, which is here in Ontario. On August 10th of that year, and in each subsequent year, prisoners in Canada and around the world have engaged in hunger strikes and work stoppages in memory of those who have died behind bars, and also as a way to support their demands for reforms. And so I want to emphasize that at this moment as we speak, there are thousands of prisoners in Canada and around the world currently engaged in work strikes and hunger strikes. And so I think that's important context for our discussion today. And I think that highlighting Canadian prisoners' activism today in the context of this discussion is also important for at least two reasons. One, I think it's important to remind us that while it's necessary to oppose state repression in the context of states of exception, prison systems, even when bound by the rule of law, are key institutions that enforce and reproduce social inequality. And movements for justice that challenge state power always have and always will find themselves in conflict with the law, and incarceration is one of the forms that conflict takes. Secondly, the fact that Canadian prisoners' activism through Prisoners' Justice Day and other means has taken on an international character points to the promise and importance of international solidarity. While the Canadian government and Canadian corporations have a long and shameful history of imperialism in Latin America, there is also a long tradition of solidarity between people of Canada and the people of Latin America, and I hope that this event represents a small but meaningful continuation of that tradition, one that will help us move from merely discussions and awareness to action and genuine solidarity. So with all that said, I'd like to turn to our panel. We are very grateful to have 5 expert panelists with an incredible wealth of knowledge and experience. Because we do have a full panel, I'll ask each speaker to limit themselves to 10 minutes, and this will ensure that we have some time for the Q&A. Our first panelist is Ingrid Escobar. She holds an education degree, a BA in legal sciences, which is the equivalent of a law degree, and a master's in human rights and peace culture. As a lawyer, Ingrid specializes in human rights, labor rights, and women's rights. She has over a decade of experience in union leadership and the promotion of social justice, and served as Director of Humanitarian Legal Assistance from 2022 to 2025. Based first in El Salvador and then in Mexico. In that capacity, she has defended victims of state repression, prosecution. Now based in Mexico, for the past year, she has been a member of the Roundtable on Salvadoran Exile. So with all that for me, I would now like to turn it over to the panel. First up, we have Ingrid.
Gracias. Bueno.
First of all, I want to thank the people who organized this event from Canada. Those joining us virtually, both our panelists and guests, and those of you physically present in Canada listening to these presentations. On behalf of the victims we represent, a humanitarian legal relief organization, we thank you for listening. Now, the situation in El Salvador in the context of the state of emergency that dates back from March 2022 to now, right? We're already in August 2026. Meaning we've had 55 months of this state of emergency in El Salvador. In these few minutes, I'll try to talk a little bit about it. You've already explained who we are. The background of the state of emergency, what gave rise to this measure, the state of emergency itself during all this time, the positive impacts of the state of emergency, but also the negative aspects of the state of emergency. You've already explained that, haven't you? We are a human rights organization that was born precisely in response to the arbitrary acts committed when the state of emergency began in March. And that is what we have been trying to do. Support the victims, accompany the victims during these almost 55 months of this measure. And well, the background to this problem, to what we are currently experiencing. Before the state of emergency, there was something in our country called the Territorial Control Plan, but there was also, during that Territorial Control Plan, between 2019 and 2022, a pact with the gangs, that is, a negotiation between officials in the government of Nayib Bukele and gang leaders. This negotiation, unfortunately, collapsed repeatedly between 2019 and 2022, leaving widespread bloodshed, that is, many murders of civilians who are definitely victims of the gangs, but also victims of the state, who, to this day, unfortunately, have not received justice either. So, this precedes the state of emergency measure. When in our country, as stated in Article 29 of our Constitution, there are disturbances to public order, as happened with the collapse of this pact, the state of emergency is permitted, and that's what happened. This measure was taken on March 27, 2022, which means suspending certain rights established in the Constitution for the entire population. Among these, I can mention, for example, the right of individuals to be detained for only 3 days in administrative detention, which was extended to 15 days. The fact that people's telecommunications cannot be violated also changed. Today it can be, and even after 54 months, this right is still suspended. And furthermore, and this is how it happens in practice, there is no longer due process, no right to defense, no right to a hearing, and no presumption of innocence. And I want to say, this applies not only to gang members but also to the general population. This regime measure was preceded by the pact, the collapse of the pact, and then the suspension of rights for the entire population. And I want to say something, we have a graph here. If those listening would like to see this presentation, we can share it with you later. I want to tell you that this graph shows that there was indeed a pact, right? We already had a precedent in the government of Mauricio Funes, another president, where there was a truce, which was a mistake. We have another precedent, which is the real war against gangs in the government of Salvador Sanchez Cerén, where there was no pact, no negotiation. And then there's the pact between the Bukele government and the gangs, where there has indeed been a reduction in homicides, but that's precisely because of that pact and that negotiation. So, this background is important for us. Okay, the state of emergency began on March 27th. It limits certain guarantees, which is what I've mentioned. And although the Constitution establishes that this can only be in place for 30 days, 60 days maximum, we've already had this measure for almost 4.5 years. It's important to talk about this, because we're not only going to talk about the, let's say, negative side of the state of emergency, we have to recognize the advantages that, although they depended on a pact, the population recognizes, and that's the, let's say, positive impact of the measure. Obviously, there's a historic reduction in homicides. There are fewer visible homicides on the streets. Obviously, we also have this other aspect, which is the apparent dismantling of gang structures, the arrest of gang members, or, let's say, the dismantling of the gang's base. We have the recovery of public spaces, social normalcy. People recognize it that way. Thanks to this pact I mentioned and the implementation of the state of emergency. And we also have a positive economic impact, at least, that's what the companies, let's say, the oligarchy in El Salvador, acknowledge that this decrease in homicides has had a positive impact on the economy for large corporations. Growth in tourism and international reputation have also been positive, and Bukele's propaganda plays a significant role in this as well. And, of course, and this is undeniable, the high public approval and social legitimacy of this measure, this state of emergency, have also been significant. We're also going to talk about the negative aspects of the state of emergency, which I think is the most worrying part at a time when it seems that not only is things becoming normalized, but we've also lost democracy under this measure. And the first issue is the suspension of constitutional rights and guarantees. The right to personal liberty is suspended for the entire population. A simple anonymous call is enough for any Salvadoran to be arrested and potentially murdered or have their human rights violated within the prison system. There is a massive number of human rights violations occurring while in prison. While the investigation is ongoing, people have been denied their right to health, their right to physical integrity. And in the worst cases, which you can see here, these are the faces of at least 555 people whose lives were not respected during the investigation process. The vast majority of these people had sufficient evidence to prove their innocence, did not fit the profile of gang members, and are being killed within the prison system. There is a violation of due process, no presumption of innocence, no right to legal counsel, no fair trial, and all of this, obviously, is a daily reality in El Salvador. We experience it every day. And people are reporting it. There are violations of constitutional guarantees, as I mentioned at the beginning. The extension of detention periods, it's no longer 3 days. Now it's 15 days, and the implementation and reform of this system of anonymous judges, right? This is serious because it's something unprecedented in post-war El Salvador. In these more than 3 decades since the war, the criminal process has also changed in its stages. There are decrees that have served to halt investigations and keep people detained without the right to at least be told whether they are innocent or guilty. And the worst thing of all is what we are about to face: mass trials, where a figure called a cooperating witness will suffice, a witness, let's say, who is given benefits for saying they recognize a group of people, and this group of people can range from 90 to 1,500 people in a single trial. This violates the right of individuals to be judged for their actions, and that is very serious and very dangerous. There are 92,000 people detained in these 4 years of the state of emergency. At least 30% of those detained are considered innocent, meaning they have no ties to gangs. This is what the government calls the margin of error, right? It's incredibly large. And it has already claimed many lives. Many people have been murdered in the prison system, or left to die due to denial of medical treatment. Another important point is that many people have obtained court orders for their release. We're talking about hundreds of people, where the judges themselves have ordered their freedom. But the prison system has refused to comply with these court orders. Why has the government detained so many innocent people? We have this analysis that I want to present, which is that there is a requirement for detention quotas, that is, police and military personnel have been given daily detention quotas in exchange for receiving benefits. The use of anonymous calls, false accusations, and the misuse of this state of emergency have been permitted. Many people have been detained solely for their appearance, their way of dressing, their haircut, their tattoos, which aren't necessarily offensive, but rather artistic tattoos. They've been detained for personal or romantic problems, for defending human rights. We have a great many political prisoners, union members, and social activists in general. People have also been unjustly detained for eliminating competition between businesses, for personal grudges, and for having any criminal record. We also have an international crime that occurs under this state of emergency: enforced disappearances. Detained by state agents. We don't really know if these people are in the prison the government claims they are in, and the institutions refuse to provide information. Protection systems like the United Nations have recognized that, under the state of emergency, the international crime of enforced disappearance exists, and thousands of people are in this situation. We have also identified patterns of torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading acts, such as beatings upon arrival at prison, and physical torture for anything they consider an offense. There is extreme overcrowding in 8 of the 23 prisons. Food is inadequate or non-existent, and many people suffer from severe malnutrition. There is a proliferation of diseases. They aren't given medicine. There is a lack of medical care. Slavery, free labor without any benefits. There are sexual assaults against women and against men detained under investigation. This is what is happening. This is a photograph of a person, part of his body, showing how he was injured and managed to survive. Here we have other photographs of some examples of torture, right? People who have been injured, beaten, who have ended up in hospitals. Severely malnourished, among other things. Here we have other photographs that are examples, signs of torture found on some deceased inmates whom we have documented, as I insist. We have some photographs of them here. Their skulls have been fractured, their ribs broken, terrible things that happen in the prison system. Let's talk about the deceased. Our organization, Humanitarian Legal Aid, and other organizations have documented deaths in the prison system. I want to say something, the deaths could number in the thousands. It is estimated that more than 2,000 people have died in the prison system. In the case of Humanitarian Legal Aid, we have confirmation of 555 victims, of which the preliminary cause is that 50% were violent deaths, and 50% were due to denial of medical treatment. An important statistic is this 94%. These were people with no criminal record, no tattoos, and the community recognized them as good people, and that is sufficient indication that they were innocent people who took the truth to their graves. And we are currently trying to achieve some measure of justice for them. I'm going to omit this for the sake of time, but I want to tell you that within the prison system, and there are only 8 prisons that are overcrowded, or rather, concentrated out of a total of 23, 8 are the ones that house people being prosecuted for the crime of belonging to illicit groups or gangs. And the worst of all, the one no one talks about, is the Azalca prison. Most of the people who are murdered or left to die due to denial of medical treatment come from that prison. There's also Mariona, which is another prison, a Panteo, where the women are held, and quite far away, if you look, is the Socorro prison. This is an indicator, pay close attention, that the people being killed in the prison system are primarily people being prosecuted who haven't been convicted. Because in Socorro, although there are innocent people being prosecuted, the vast majority are convicted gang members. So, that should also shed some light on what's happening in the prison system regarding the deaths within it. I'd like you to let me know when I have 2 minutes left. Excuse me. I can't see the clock here. Here are the faces of some innocent people who have died, the ones I have here behind me. What I want to show you, the audience, is that these faces you see here are nothing like the faces presented in Bukele's propaganda. Bukele's propaganda says he's arresting gang members who, if you look at them, are tattooed from head to toe, and have sentences of up to 1,000 years or more. But in reality, the people they're arresting are these faces you see here, church pastors, union leaders, professionals, workers in general. Here are the faces of some women who have died or been murdered in the prison system, and they don't appear in Bukele's propaganda either. They will never show these faces. We also have cases of babies who have been left to die due to denial of medical treatment within the prison system. They are the sons and daughters of incarcerated individuals. Well, obviously there are consequences. This measure affects women, their families, and communities. There's an increase in internal and external migration. Family members are dying without ever seeing their children released, because many mothers die in the process. Children are being affected in various ways. There are more than 100,000 children affected, children of these detainees, and the government isn't providing them with any kind of support. I want to tell you, there's a direct attack. And this is an escalation that began in 2025. It's a direct attack against human rights defenders. There's no freedom of association under this state of emergency. They've created a law called the Foreign Agents Law, which obstructs the work of organizations. There's persecution and the creation of criminal charges against journalists who have investigated government corruption and the government's pact with gangs. Human rights organizations are being dismantled. There's persecution and criminalization of government critics, such as the political prisoners I could mention. Here's the case of Ruth Lopez. The case of Enrique Anaya, among others. Here we have some organizations that the government constantly attacks. They prosecute many of these cases. Some of them are represented here, people who are going to speak, right? The case of the environmentalists, the case of UNIDE, fellow lawyers, the National Alliance for Peace in El Salvador. Fellow activists, Cristasol, which is now in Guatemala, FESPAD, which had to close its operations, MOVIR, which has also faced persecution against some of its spokespeople, in our case. Socorro Juridico, which has personally forced me into exile, Reverde, among other organizations that have been attacked by this government. These are some of the faces of the people most affected by violence as human rights defenders in the country, many of whom are detained, political prisoners. Others who have even had to admit to crimes they never committed. Unfortunately, this is now persecuted. Defending human rights, freedom of expression, freedom of association, these are now crimes in El Salvador. Some of these newspapers have also had to flee El Salvador. These are some of them. El Faro, Factum, the Journalists Association, whose president had to leave the country. These organizations and newspapers that have investigated corruption also had many of their journalists forced to leave El Salvador during the last year of this administration. In conclusion, I want to say that the truth is always the truth, and that is what we are presenting. Even though our truth may not be as popular as the propaganda of the neo-fascist dictatorship we live under in El Salvador.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Ingrid. Next, we have Samuel. Samuel Ramirez, who is an engineer in computer sciences, a human rights defender, and coordinator of the movement of the victims of the state of exception in El Salvador. He combines his technical training with advocacy work to launch initiatives in community organizing, strategic communication, and documentation of cases related to human rights protection. In recent years, he has accompanied families affected by arbitrary detention, promoting respect for due process, access to justice, and the defense of fundamental rights. He will be sharing his experience regarding the challenges of this work and the importance of constructing a society based on justice, legality, and respect for human dignity.
Bueno, thank you, Ingrid, for that presentation. And thank you also to everyone present at this event. Thanks to the organizers as well. It is very important for us to reach this country, Canada. People who are also very concerned about what is happening in the country. Well, Ingrid almost said it, but I want to tell you that in the case of MOVIR, it is a movement of victims. We are not an NGO. We are not a foundation. We are not an organization that receives funding from anyone. We are an organization sustained by the worry and anguish of mothers seeking justice, seeking freedom for their loved ones, seeking ways to prove the innocence of those who were arbitrarily captured by the state of exception. We turned 4 years old this coming August 16th. We emerged about 4 months after the regime began. In our country, when the regime started, people didn't know what to do. Many human rights organizations were no longer able to keep up with assisting victims because they were a factory where every day hundreds of people were captured without due process, without an arrest warrant, without a prior investigation. People were captured just for living in communities that were already besieged by gangs. Many of the people who are now victims of the regime were victims of the gangs. The gangs murdered their parents, their siblings, and now the regime has captured the rest of the family. In other words, the regime has criminalized poverty in this country. It has criminalized youth because the regime is only affecting the poor. We don't see a millionaire here, or people with economic resources, even if they were gang members. Now we see that those people are government officials, they are deputies, they are public employees. But those people who cannot afford a private lawyer to defend them properly are the people who are being held in prison, 4 months, almost 4 years of being held in preventative detention without a crime being proven, and yet they remain imprisoned. The family, they claim that they are disappeared because since these people were captured, the last time they saw them was when they were put into a patrol car, and from that moment on, nobody knows what happened. They are told they are in a certain prison to bring them packages, to deposit money, but no one can confirm that the person is actually being held there. People spend money every month on care packages, an average of $100 a month on care packages. If they come from far away, you have to pay another $50 for transport. You also have to deposit money. You have to pay lawyers, in some cases scammers, who offer to get your child or loved one out of jail in 3 days, and in the end, just take your money. So there is a situation that is unbearable in this country. MOVIR has visited all government institutions. We have visited the Human Rights Ombudsman's office. We have asked them to speak out, to attend to the victims, to fulfill that constitutional mandate, which is to ensure the respect for human rights. An ombudsman's office that emerged from the peace accords, a peace that cost us so much blood back in 1992. And now it turns out we have an ombudsman's office totally submitted to the regime. There is a lady there who was already re-elected for a second time because she has done a good job for the government. She is a woman who has no scruples about hiding the violation of human rights. We have visited the Supreme Court of Justice to ask them to declare the state of exception unconstitutional. The state of exception is no longer legal because in this country, the Constitution says that the state of exception, state of siege, martial law, or curfew, like there was during the war, is a tool that the regime or the government has in case of extreme emergency in the country, in case of a threat to the territory, in case of a social conflict or internal war, in case of a large-scale catastrophe. And the justification for the regime was the 80 deaths. Of course, we are deeply saddened by those people who died in those 3 days, but that cause has disappeared. There hasn't been another situation like that. However, they keep extending the regime because they say they want to guarantee security in this country. President Bukele has already acknowledged that we are the safest country in the Western Hemisphere. So why continue with a state of exception? Why keep limiting the rights of all Salvadorans? Because the state of exception is not only to combat gangs, it is a regime that makes all Salvadorans vulnerable, and we could be captured at any moment. We can be taken to jail without the right to a defense attorney. Here we don't have the right to a presumption of innocence. In the case of Ruth Lopez, she has the best lawyers, but they can't do anything either because the regime is completely arbitrary. The judicial processes, the arrests. So we have even given this whole situation. I would like you to show some images of the struggle MOVIR has engaged in. MOVIR has been quite limited to street activism, highlighting human rights violations, highlighting those arbitrary arrests and the negligence in the various state institutions that don't listen to the victims. We have even sued the Attorney General of the Republic because the public defenders are not doing their jobs as the law requires. They don't care about defending the innocence of these people because they are public employees. Whether they defend them or not, whether they work or not, they still get their salary. Yeah. And what is this person's justification? That there is a heavy workload, that there are few employees for such a huge demand of arbitrary arrests. So, but what has the government done? Instead of hiring more lawyers, they have fired lawyers. They have further hindered the speed of their processes. Here, for example, in this photo, we are at the presidential palace delivering more than 250 case files of people presumed innocent, which we reviewed with lawyers, including evidence of community ties, people who were students, engineers, professionals, teachers, public employees, union members, and we have had no response to that documentation we presented to Nayib Bukele. Well, here we also have an image where I think the Legal Aid Office participated. Ingrid was there too, which was when the country was hosting Miss Universe, the most important beauty pageant in the world. It was being held in the country as a smokescreen that Bukele wanted to use to hide the human rights violations. And look at how they received us, with tear gas, with tanks, with the army. They didn't allow us to reach the hotel where the contestants were, and so that is one of a series of activities MOVIR has carried out in the streets. Well, in this photo, we were victims of an attempted arrest by the police. We were coming from an activity after the Central American Sports Games had been held, which was another smokescreen, where we denounced the arbitrary arrests and dismantled the government's narrative that this country was about sports and recreation. Many media outlets covered us, and I think we touched a nerve. They pursued us, they pulled us off a bus, and they made us put our hands up right there. And finally, well, I think the public denouncement we made immediately through the media that arrived, like El Diario de Hoy, La Prensa Gráfica, UCA, that, well, prevented the arrest from becoming a reality. So we have faced certain situations. Well, we have also held marches and press conferences. We have exhausted everything in this country. We have even visited the Apostolic Nuncio himself to ask that the Catholic Church also speak out against human rights violations. We have visited the Archbishop of San Salvador, Luis Escobar, so that he would also speak out against human rights violations, and they have closed their doors to us. They don't want to speak out against the state of exception. It seems that, regarding the regime, I don't know if there is some commitment, what arrangements they have, but they don't want to touch the trophy or the most important part of this government, which is the state of exception, because the state of exception, as I said a moment ago, is no longer necessary in this country. If we are the safest country, why continue with a state of exception? But the state of exception is now used to instill fear in people. Well, here we are at the presidential palace. There we are, amidst the soldiers and everyone else. It was a Christmas that we commemorated there in front of the presidential palace. There we have it. I think it was a march we held where people from Bajo Lempa came. Several organizations like COFAPE were there. I think Socorro was also there. And well, there we also denounced and asked Bukele to present us with a report on the documentation we had submitted. We have also taken actions to recreate for the children, to entertain the children, because there is a very serious emotional situation for the children who have been abandoned by their parents. So we have held children's parties where we have tried to make them forget that anguish and pain for a moment, to try to soften that situation. We have also been at the Judicial Center for Organized Crime in Soyapango, where we have also asked against mass trials, because what happens with those mass trials? The prosecution could not prove the crimes in 4 years, in 3 years, in 2 years. And what did they invent? Mass trials? And what are mass trials? It's linking innocent people to crimes committed by a gang, and in that way being able to justify a conviction. There's also a very situation that I want to mention. Bukele acknowledged her in Costa Rica. Well, this is a visit we made to Germany. We were with Congresswoman Akbulut, and now, well, I am part of a human rights defender protection program in Germany from the German parliament because they have seen the risk we human rights defenders face here in El Salvador. So I think it is great support that Germany is also providing, and they have placed all the resources they have at hand at our disposal to make reports in case of an arrest. So I think that also legitimizes our struggle and gives us some protection. Here we were at the prison where the war veteran comrades are in the western part of Santa Ana, who also went there to speak out, deputies who are wary of what is happening in the country. But let's go back to the topic of mass trials. I was telling you that now they are convicting people for crimes not committed, but there is fear. Bukele acknowledged in Costa Rica that he had released more than 8,000 people with alternative measures to detention, and they were released. Now they are rearresting them and sentencing them to 20, 40, or 60 years. So I asked Nayib Bukele, where is that promise he made to release all the innocent people? And a definitive release, not a temporary situation. These people who are in that situation of house arrest cannot work, cannot leave the country, and are totally subjected by the regime. And now, what are private lawyers telling them? Because they know there is a very certain conviction for these people after the hearings that they had better leave the country, because private lawyers cannot guarantee that they will be set free in that judicial process, in those mass hearings. I mean, these people don't know what to do anymore. They are desperate, anxious, and are looking for some form of political asylum in another country, because the problem is that Bukele sells a safe El Salvador, where he calls on tourists to travel to visit recreational areas, concerts, shows, lights. But with that, he wants to hide the reality that the victims live. We have carried out hundreds of actions. There we were, in front of the Metropolitan Cathedral of San Salvador, making the victims visible. We have carried out numerous street activities. We have also denounced officials for failing to fulfill their mandates. We have denounced and even sued the Legislative Assembly's Board of Directors because they refused to accept a document from MOVIR in which we requested the repeal of Decree 803, a decree that allows for prolonged detentions. As Ingrid said, in this country, under the traditional system, the law states that a person can only be held for 3 days while a crime is being investigated. If it is not proven within 72 hours, they must be released. With the state of exception, they were given 15 days, but those 15 turned into 5 years, and the prosecutor's office, instead of releasing them, has invented mass trials to convict them. So colleagues, this is the situation we are denouncing, and we are asking international organizations to help us make the victims in El Salvador visible, to help us demand that their governments condition any financial aid to the Salvadoran government on the respect for human rights, and to join us in the demand to repeal the state of exception and restore the rule of law, because here in this country there is no rule of law. Everything has been dismantled by the regime. The regime is the cover for the violation of all human rights. For example, the regime here allows for the most appalling corruption in this government because everything is arbitrary, everything is an exception. We believe that, and we are not saying that repealing the state of exception will bring gangs back to the streets. The government must provide security without a state of exception that subjects the entire population and limits their guarantees and rights. We believe it is time for a security policy that does not affect innocent people, because as our colleague said, it is estimated that nearly 30% those captured during the state of exception are presumed innocent, as it has been proven there was no crime committed and no prior investigation. This means they are innocent. But instead of releasing them permanently, they are convicting them by grouping them with gang members to justify the sentence. And that is the denunciation we make whenever we have the opportunity. We also want to denounce the issue of the use they are making of those deprived of liberty as free labor. There is a program called Zero Leisure in this country for inmates who are in a phase of trust, people who are finishing their time in prison, their sentence, and have good behavior. For them, there is a plan where for every day worked, they are given 2 days off, but they have a number of innocent people who haven't been convicted, who are in preventative detention and are being used as free labor. They don't even give them food. They don't even give them water. They don't give them a single cent. However, the companies that hire these people pay the Salvadoran state more than $1. Who is doing business with these people? And there are many, many people who have died from risky work, electrocuted, because they weren't given protective equipment, and there is no compensation for these people, for these families. The people who are detained are treated like true slaves, like mere animals, with no rights to anything. Even the families who are seeking justice, who are seeking freedom, are not heard by anyone. Either the Human Rights Ombudsman's office doesn't listen. Neither does the Supreme Court, nor the Attorney General's office, not even the Bishop of San Salvador listens to the victims. What they do is criminalize us. They attack us. They accuse us of defending gang members. Well, today on Mother's Day, May 10th, we had a very strong attack from the regime's trolls. They activated many people who are content creators to accuse our mothers of defending gang members, and they even made montages to try to justify that they were criminals and to delegitimize MOVIR's struggle. However, we believe that we have done very transparent work, very recognized at an international level. While MOVIR has been recognized by a Washington organization called WOLA for defending human rights and for being a movement that promotes peace in El Salvador, we are a pacifist movement. We do not generate violence. If there are people who provoke us, who insult us, we try to avoid it because we want to be consistent with what we ask for, which is justice and respect for human rights. So perhaps as not to prolong the situation further, I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Next, we are going to hear from Leslie. Leslie Schuld is a co-founder and director of the Center for Exchange and Solidarity, CIS, in El Salvador. She holds a master's in human rights and peace education from the University of El Salvador. The organization, CIS, which has just celebrated its 33rd anniversary, works to promote relationships of solidarity and mutual respect to empower communities with scarce economic resources to work for social and economic justice. Leslie has been advocating for the defense of innocent victims of the regime of exception in the communities where CIS works.
Okay, thank you for organizing this forum, and thank you, Ingrid and Samuel, for your work and for the analysis that you gave. Just a compliment, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the mass trials. They began at the end of January, and the first trial that the government promoted in propaganda was 486 criminals that they're charged with like 50,000 crimes, and it's and people and the press is allowed in, but they're not allowed in the other ones where innocent people are being tried together with criminals. And I think these to get the essence of this, these mass trials are between 50 and 900 people. The lawyers have 1 minute to meet with their client virtually, so they've had no access to talk to their lawyers, whether they're public or private. And the defense lawyers can put up arguments, because we've had 2 people from communities already convicted of 25 and 30 years, and people are all convicted between 20 and 60 years. But the so-called collaborators, which are mostly victims of the gangs that were forced It's not like they, oh, I want to help the gangs. They're forced to give them food or transportation or lookout. And they, if you don't help them, they know where your mother lives, your child lives, your spouse lives, and you're threatened with death. So many of the people in prison are victims. So the so-called collaborators are given 20, 25, or 30 years, and the gang members are given 45 or 60 years. Besides that, most of the trials that are going on, they're not being accused of any crime, just of being a member of the structure, whether it's a collaborator or an actual member. The judge in this trial opened the trial saying, we are here to convict 66 members of the MS Mara Salvatrucho gang, not to look for justice. And there were 66 people in the trial. As Samuel mentioned, and the only proof that the judge takes into account is a hooded criminal, his testimony. And he pointed the finger at all 66 people, which it's doubtful that he knew all 66. Some he is an admitted criminal, so he had details on some, but many he just said that they were lookouts for the gangs or they sold marijuana for the gangs. And every one of those was given 20, 25, or 30 years. And so the defense lawyers presented legal documents that they didn't have a criminal record. As if people are familiar with El Salvador, the gangs came in and out of prison frequently. The government blocked issuing criminal clearances because so many people were innocent and had no record, because that is one of the proof of innocence. Because here the presumption of innocence is suspended as well as due process. So people presented those documents, the defense lawyers. We presented witnesses because the police write-up was a complete lie and people were witnesses to that. We presented legal documents contradicting what the police and what the witness said, including because the witness said that that this person did look out for the gang, but there was no picture, no evidence. Other people, he said, sold marijuana for the gang between 2010 and 2012. Well, the law is not retroactive, as well as the penalty between 2010 and 2012 was 3 to 5 years for collaborators. And the judge said, we're not here to prove or disprove if they did the lookout or sold marijuana. We're here just to prove that they were in the gang structure. And the only proof presented was this hooded criminal witness who admitted criminal. He also admitted through our attorneys questioning that the attorney general had showed him the pictures and the names of the 66 people to point the finger at. Now, of course, they were condemned on March 24th, and according to the law, they have to have a sentencing, the written arguments for why they were condemned, in 30 days. It has been over 4 months, and there's no sentencing to be able to appeal. And of course, they're going to have a lot of problems since it's all, much of it is based on lies. Of those 66 people, 29 had evidence being gang members because they had tattoos, gang tattoos, and that was enough that they got 45 or 60 years. So that was really the only proof of that was presented of any actual membership in the gang. So nobody was actually convicted of a crime, just of being a member of the structure. And even though our people, he said, were active between 2010 and 2012, collaborators, the judge, that's what they were accused of. There was no proof of that, but the judge said that was, once you are a collaborator, it's for life, even though this was several years ago. So just to give you a sense of the gravity. So 91,500 or 92,000 people are being brought to trial. The 8,000 innocent people that Bukele said in Costa Rica that he liberated, that was conditional freedom. And those people are now being called to hearings where they are being re-arrested. And many say they would rather die than go back to those conditions, which Ingrid, pointed out. And, one toilet to 250 men. The women's prison, they had buckets. They didn't even have a toilet. People leaving with scabies, with kidney failure, just horrendous conditions. So and just to give you an example, because I was outside, of course, nobody's allowed in. And I think it's important to remember why the popularity continues, because everything is under a 7-year total reserve. All this information is secret, and you can be arrested for revealing some of this, and the lawyers will be disbarred if they share the information. But I was at this hearing outside of one of these special tribunals against organized crime that have been set up. There was a woman there. She had a hearing, or it was actually her trial. She had a trial. It wasn't a mass trial because she was a minor when she was arrested, and she had been freed the last 4 years. She was pregnant. She gave birth in prison. She was there with her 1.5 and 3.5-year-old child. She was a young woman, no tattoos, very humble, innocent, but it's just like, cuts your heart right in half. The judge would not, she was a single mother. The judge would not let her bring her children into the court. So I was there with many community members protesting outside the tribunal. And so we said, go to your trial, we'll take care of the kids, but we can only do it until our trial's over, because we drove, 3 hours to get there. Well, the judge would, and our trial was over, and I called, I notified that we were going to have to leave. The judge would not let her out for lunch, but her attorney came out to explain the situation. We had to find a sister-in-law that was in La Union, so I had to travel 3 hours. We had to wait for her to get there to take care of these kids. And I'm sure she was coming to take care of them during the trial, not for 30 years. The young woman was convicted to 30 years. She's a minor. They have changed the law to try minors as adults. The Attorney General asked for 45 years, and she was convicted to 30 years in prison. And she has a 1.5 and 3.5-year-old child. Just to let you know the gravity of the situation, and the 8,000 innocent people admitted. Of course, there's many more. I would even sustain more than 30% based on Bukele's own words. He publicized and bragged in January that he has 45,000 prisoners working, as Samuel mentioned. And he clarified he does not give that privilege to assassins. Well, to be a gang member, you have to be an assassin. You have to assassinate at least one person. So he doesn't have the gang members, although he's now publicizing he wants to Sekat people to work, but in Sekat, he doesn't have gang members building the schools, setting up the stage for Shakira, building bakeries, private bakeries, or the private zoo for Furesa, or Osiris Luna's mother's beach house. He's the head of the prisons. He has innocent prisoners doing these jobs. And he also, in January, in his own Twitter, he said, half of the people will be out in 10 years. Well, the minimum sentence is 20 years. And so he knows he has them working, and of course they'll have half their sentence. So I think he knows that half are innocent from his own words. But it's a very grave situation, and I know I think Ingrid and Samuel gave a great overview. So and probably people have questions, but I just want to also add, I think it's important for the international community to set up a commission to investigate these mass trials and the lack of absence of all due process. I think, and there was a hearing in Washington, D.C. about the state of exception as well. And there, some of the world experts, and I think in the heat-based report of human rights experts from around the world, they called for a commission also to review all the people that are accused, because they're not getting a fair trial, to review the records so that innocent people can be released. And of course, the prison conditions are horrendous. Another story, you know, even though they now show pictures of the prisoners working in these maquilas, making uniforms and building and blah, 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 that he's training all these people, but as slave labor, of course, as Samuel said, you know, the reality is a different thing. And so there's also people continuing to die in prison, as Ingrid and Socorro Juridico continue. Those are the documented cases. We have another community we work in. A mother of 8 children, she was arrested 2 years ago in July of 2024. In April of 2026, she was diagnosed with kidney disease. And at the end of June, she was murdered in the women's prison at Panteos. These are not acceptable conditions. There's violation of all the Mandela rules of treatment of prisoners. And so I would also call on people to work on independent conditions to assess, investigate the situation in the prisons, not guided tours, not say caught where they let the press and international commissions in, but principally Izalco, Apanteos, and Mariona, where the deaths are occurring, where people are, and we've had, you know, our first person arrested was one of our Spanish teachers. And that was in April of 2022. And recently, one of the parents of one of our staff was also arrested. And he got out on the 15-day trial. He was in one of the prisons 3 months, but he had scabies. He lost 30 pounds in 3 months. So the conditions in the prison, even though they show these beautiful photos of all these maquilas and how happy people are, and the, you know, the reality is still grave conditions in the prison. So I would ask for those 3 things. An independent commission to review the files of every of those 92,000, an international commission to free the innocents, to an independent commission to visit the prisons, not a guided tour. And so, yeah, to investigate those things, and thirdly, the mass trials. They're not they're kangaroo courts. They jump over any step for due process. So thank you for your interest. And yes, it's a very high cost that we're paying for this so-called security. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Next, we'll hear from Lisa Kowalchuk, is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Guelph. She first traveled to El Salvador in July 1991. Subsequently, she carried out several academic research projects there on topics that included land reform and campesino protest, healthcare privatization, and the social movement to stop it, and the labor conditions of nurses, which she compared to the situation in Nicaragua. All told, she lived in El Salvador for over 4 years. Since 2023, she participates in the International Allies Against Mining in El Salvador. She is also a member of the Americas Policies Group and co-chairs its steering committee.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks so much, Leslie, and thank you, Samuel and Ingrid, for what you shared with us. So we promised that we would address the question of how the current situation in El Salvador matters to Canada. Now, given what our expert panelists have just shared with us, it almost feels out of place to ask that question, because in a way the answer is so obvious. Human rights violations on this scale, anywhere in the world, why it matters. So human rights violations on this scale, no matter where they're happening in the world, are relevant to all Canadians, because we're all one human race. And you know, the international experts concluded a few months ago that the state of exception, human rights violations taking place under it, constitute crimes against humanity, and we're all part of humanity. Nevertheless, Canada does have a few specific connections with what our guests have shared, and I think they're worth mentioning, so I'm just going to briefly share a few thoughts. First, and perhaps the most important connection to what our guests have shared, is the Salvadoran community in Canada. But I'm going to come back to this one. I'm going to go on to the next couple of points. So I'll come back. The second connection to mention is that Canada invested in El Salvador's peace process at the end of the Civil War. It did this first by providing personnel to a United Nations commission that oversaw a peace process throughout Central America between the 5 countries. And that was started in 1989, and that was really important for laying the foundations for the peace negotiation in El Salvador. And soon after that, Canada provided military personnel to ONUSAL, the UN Peace Observer Mission in El Salvador. Started doing that in 1991, just before the peace accords, and continued doing that until 1995. Initially, we had the biggest contingent of military, second largest contingent of military staff at ONUSAL. But not only military personnel, but also Canada, through the Canadian International Development Agency, earmarked $5 million just to support the peace accords, the peace process, by funding projects for poverty reduction, democracy building, and human rights. And I mention all this because Bukele, his government, has swept aside the peace accords and done so quite explicitly. He's dismissed the peace accords as simply a pact between corrupt actors. And whether or not you like the parties that signed the peace accords, if you like the Arena party that governed at the time, or the FMLN that was a guerrilla force at that time and became a political party later, regardless of that, the accords are widely considered to have brought El Salvador much closer to democracy than it had been before, further along the path to democracy. Through an end to military intervention in governing and policing. Admittedly, that was imperfectly upheld, but it was a major transformation and a major stride forward thanks to the peace accords. Also allowing the flourishing of critical journalism and allowing political opposition. And all 3 of those things have been depressingly reversed. And Canada and Canadians should care, because we had then and we still do have a stake in the military, judicial, and electoral and human rights reforms that the peace accords encompassed. Third point to mention is Canada has continued providing official development assistance to El Salvador. In 2024 to 25, Canada's ODA, official development assistance to El Salvador, was just over 11.4 million. But the future of our aid program is in question now due to the Foreign Agents Law that was passed in May of last year. It wasn't mentioned so far by any of our panelists. But alongside this state of exception, the Foreign Agents Law is another tool for centralizing presidential power and extinguishing critical voices. Under the law, any organization that receives funding from overseas has to register as a foreign agent. And their programs have to meet criteria set by the Ministry of the Interior. So if the government doesn't like what an NGO does, like say, for example, providing programming for gender equality or LGBTQ rights, it can simply refuse authorization for those programs and projects to go ahead. And furthermore, the other thing the law contains is that foreign donations of money, services, and goods are hit with a 30% tax that they have to pay to the Salvadoran government, unless they apply for an exemption and are granted an exemption. But the criteria for the exemption are not transparent and they've not been made clear. The Americas Director at Human Rights Watch says this about the Foreign Agents Law, quote, "There is no doubt that it is about silencing those who expose corruption, human rights violations, and secretive negotiations with gang leaders by the Bukele government," unquote. The law is similar to ones that were passed in Russia and Nicaragua, which we know are true stalwarts of authoritarianism. In El Salvador, it's already had the effect of prompting some international donors to leave the country, and it has caused the closure of several widely respected Salvadoran organizations whose role was to uphold transparency and due process. So this is another way that Canada has a specific kind of stake in what happens to democracy in El Salvador. Why would Canada allow its development assistance to be taxed in El Salvador when it only represents revenue from taxpayers in Canada? We're going to be taxed twice for our development assistance. And can Canada expect tax exemptions from the Salvadoran government for aid programming which adheres to Canadian values, including feminist, international feminist values and respect for LGBTQ rights, etc.? My fourth point is related to this third point. Among the organizations in El Salvador that face persecution and imprisonment, along with restricted access to funding, are environmentalists, because they are among the most critical of government and the most likely to hold government to account. These include water defenders, who have already been persecuted by the Bukele government for exposing his intention to bring back gold mining, very destructive gold mining. So what's the Canadian connection to that? Well, with the overturning of the ban on metal mining by the Bukele government in 2024, it may well be Canadian companies that are doing the prospecting for gold in El Salvador. And with Salvadoran water defenders persecuted and financially repressed, there might be an onus on Canadians of all ethnicities to persuade such companies that gold mining in El Salvador would not be a good idea. And now going back to the first connection I mentioned, the Salvadoran community in Canada. Does anyone know how large the Salvadoran community in Canada is? Anyone here kind of like have those figures or some ideas? So I'll tell you what the official census data is as of 2021. It indicates that there's 49,400 people who call, Salvadorans who call Canada home. Does that sound kind of low to people, those who are in the know?
Sounds like it.
It struck me as low, and you would be someone who would know that it's maybe an underestimate. So unofficial data would probably bring that higher. But in any case, it's an important community in our society. You know, contributing culturally and to the professionals in our lives, etc., in all kinds of ways. The major initial driver of Salvadorans coming to Canada in the early 1980s was the violence of the Civil War. Since 1992, but perhaps especially in the last 15 years or so, Salvadorans in Canada have also had to bear witness to the violence of the maras, the gangs, either directly themselves or through their loved ones back home being subject to murders, extortions, rapes, etc. And that's partly why the Salvadoran Canadian community is very divided in their views about the Bukele government. Thank you. With some people very much in favor of what he does, because they see him as having vanquished the gangs, right? And they have deep antipathy toward the gangs, which is very understandable and is not to be dismissed. But we decided to hold this forum to allow more people to hear about the cost of what may look like a solution to the gang problem, and to understand more about how the gang problem has been utilized as a cover for centralizing power in one person and one little grupito that surrounds this person. And with the space for speaking those truths and voicing opposition so greatly reduced in El Salvador, we felt a responsibility to open that space here. And we say this with the greatest of respect and affection toward friends and family who don't feel the same way we do about the Bukele government. We welcome a respectful dialogue between the audience and our panelists. And I'm going to pass the torch to our final panelist. And thank you.
Pedro Cabezas, who is the coordinator of the Central American Alliance Against Mining, a regional coalition of organizations and communities affected by mining projects. He studied political science at the University of Toronto and has more than 20 years of experience as a labor, mental health, and environmental justice activist. In 2013, he joined the environmental movement in El Salvador, where he played a key role in coordinating international actions to demand the prohibition of mining. Since the mining ban in the country in 2017, he has worked to strengthen regional exchange and collaboration among organizations and environmental movements in the Central American region.
Thank you, Lisa, and thanks to the organizers for this event. I know Lisa and Anna were very active in putting this event together, and approaching speakers and setting up the venue, and with the Leo Spanish School, like they have put together this amazing event, and I like to thank you for that. Particularly because in this day and age, in the current political context, there are so much issues and things happening around the world. We have the situation in the Middle East with Iran. Palestine, we have the attacks on Cuba, we have the attacks on Venezuela, and the movement or the consolidation of the right-wing political regimes all through Latin America. So that there is this panic amongst the progressive circles about, how do we move forward this agenda? Who do we support, particularly in places like Canada that are in a position that support a healthy international solidarity movement with the peoples of the world, so thank you for focusing on El Salvador. As Lisa just mentioned, in Canada, we do have a healthy, strong Salvadoran community and a history of support and not only bilateral aid from the Canadian government to El Salvador, but a lot of solidarity with through the Salvadoran community, through unions, through international solidarity organizations that over the years since the war have continued. They supported El Salvador during the war and the revolutionary movements in El Salvador during the war, but also over the years they have also supported the democratic agenda that is now under attack by the Bukele governments. I think it's important, to contextualize this as well. That what's going on in El Salvador has all the violations of human rights and the particularly brand of Nayib Bukele is very specific to El Salvador, but the rest of Central America is also going through this attack of against human rights, against human rights defenders, against civil society organization, and a tendency of authoritarian governments that are ruling not only by that are ruling not only by family regimes like we can see the Ortega regime in Nicaragua, the Bukele regime in El Salvador, and other regimes that are now they have families working very closely with military institutions to install this authoritarian agenda through Central America. And so I think it's important to connect what's going on in El Salvador with the rest of Central America, but even with the United States and Canada. Like we have Donald Trump that is trying to make Canada the 51st state of the United States. It's attacking its European partners. So it is what we see in El Salvador is a reflection of a global context where hegemonic powers are trying to establish their agenda and consolidate their control over the region. And what we see in El Salvador is a reflection of that. After Nayib Bukele won the election in El Salvador, the first visit that he made, like the first foreign visit that he made, he won the election on a very progressive agenda. He said he was going to support the LGBT agenda. He said he was going to support the environmental agenda. If you look at the electoral plan that Bukele had before he got elected, it was taken from all the different social movements and progressive movements in El Salvador. But the first visit that he made outside of El Salvador was to the United States. And he went to talk to the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation is the think tank for the Trumpist right in the United States. And after he came back from that visit, he started to change. He started to implement his agenda that was totally opposite to what he has said he would do. And it has resulted in the kind of regime that we have right now. With a lot of success at the local level in the security agenda, because as it was mentioned earlier by other speakers, Bukele has a very, he's very popular in El Salvador. He enjoys a level of popularity that no other president has had, and it's very difficult to attack Bukele because not only he's popular, but also he has a network of communications that has managed to suppress any voices of opposition formally and informally in El Salvador, as it has been explained before. And at the international level, Bukele also has achieved this popularity. And if you look at all the governments, all the presidents that have been sworn in Latin America right now, they're all talking about implementing the Bukele plan in Latin America, or taking elements of the Bukele plan to implement in their security policies. Unfortunately for Bukele, the only thing that people are copying about him are his his human rights, his policies that violate human rights, his security policies. So everybody's talking about building mass jails. Everybody's talking about hardline fight against narco trafficking and gangs. Everybody's talking about imprisoning criminals and against violating of human rights. But not other president or no other leader is talking about the economic agenda of Bukele, for instance. And the reason why they're doing that is because the economic agenda has been a failure for Bukele in the country. Ingrid mentioned in her presentation that there has been a little bit of economic growth in El Salvador, that economic growth is improving. But that economic growth the growth is improving compared to previous years. But if you compare the economic growth in El Salvador compared to the rest of Central America, it's the poorest performing economy of the region. You know, like it has less the least foreign investment. It has the least actual economic growth compared to the other economies. It has the largest level of debt in the region. It has the least creation of formal employment. There is a growth of employment in El Salvador, but all of it is informal employment as a result of the growth of the tourist industry. But the tourist industry is not generating real quality jobs in the country. And when you ask, like recently, the Central America University published a poll among Salvadorians. And one of the main issues for Salvadorans is the economy, because the day-to-day people in El Salvador, like they are not enjoying the economic growth that the government claims that is taking place in the country. And you know, like rents are high, the basic basket is high, there is no employment, the inflation is high, and people are demanding that, you know, those measures are taken to actually improve the quality of life. And that is a time bomb for the government of Nayib Bukele. In order to resolve this economic problem, I think Bukele is resorting to an extractivist economy, opening the door of the country to multinational extractive corporations to extract the few natural resources that we have in the country. You know, and Lisa was talking about mining, for instance. The government has reverted the mining prohibition that El Salvador so much struggled back in 2017 to. It was a 12-year struggle to introduce the mining prohibition. And in 2024, the government just reverted that because of the total centralization of power and the control that they have in all different levels of government. It is opening the door to atomic energy, a country with environmental vulnerabilities that El Salvador has. Atomic energy is a crime. You know, it's a potential destruction of the country because we're a vulnerable country. There is a lot of impacts of climate change. There is a lot of earthquakes that happen in the country. There are floods. We have no conditions to implement an industry like atomic energy in Central America. They're opening the tourism industry, which is already generating a lot of conflict in El Salvador. If you take a look at a regular newspaper in El Salvador of things that are happening, what you will see are mostly environmental countries environmental conflicts in the country. You know, conflicts as a result of the dispossession of land by families that are claiming that land that was given to people during the land reforms of the 80s belongs to them. This dispossession of communities on government land that has set up their families for decades. Now they're taking away that land and giving it to multinational corporations, and they're opening all the access to geothermal energy to multinational corporations as well. You know, all of this economic agenda that the government is trying to implement will be generating, and is already generating, the main sources of conflict in the country. And in order to eliminate the opposition and the community organizing against these conflicts, we have the tool of the state of exception. You know, so anybody who threatens to boycott a project that is of economic interest to the government, it's threatened or simply put in jail, and there goes the opposition. You know, like with the disappearance of our democratic rights and our human rights, we have not been able to generate this dialogue, like the engagements of civil society in ensuring that the economic agenda of the government it's responds to the needs of the population rather than the needs of the small family that controls the government now. I think in order to close, like what we have talked about is, or what I like to focus on is international solidarity and how Canada can get involved in this. We do have, as I said, a long history of international solidarity. There are political structures that we have inherited from the world that have organizations from Canada, civil society organizations, churches from Canada, connected to social movements in El Salvador. We have that in the United States as well. We have organizations in Europe that are working with local organizations in El Salvador, and we're all trying to figure out what we can do in this context. Like Samuel was describing a situation in which, like, no matter what you do at the local level, you can't change, or it's very difficult to fight against the agenda due to the control that the government has on society and all the democratic institutions of the country. But still, it is possible to fight from the international community, pressure the government to implement at least a basic democratic agenda, what the previous speakers were talking about. Bring back the constitutional rights of Salvadorians, eliminate the status exception, and let's begin prosecuting those responsible for crimes against humanity, as it has been established by the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. I think the Canadian government is an important target for you guys, as Lisa was mentioning. There was a lot of bilateral aid that was pumped into El Salvador during the post-war period, but at the same time, there was a lot of Canadian investment that was pumped into El Salvador after that period. And even though the aid has gone, the Canadian investment still lurks in the country, particularly mining companies that are interested in the minerals that the country has. As you all might know, Canada is a mining power in the Central American region. Most of the mining projects that are based here are Canadian. We have Canadian companies in Panama, in Colombia. I'm sorry, in Costa Rica and Nicaragua. We have Canadian mining companies in Guatemala. There is one specific company that is threatening El Salvador. It's based in Guatemala, but the main impacts of this mine, if it gets exploited, will be in El Salvador. It's called Aura Minerals. And there is other interests. For instance, like 12% of the sugar produced in El Salvador under very dismal conditions and precarious conditions for workers are purchased by Red Path. It's a company based in Toronto. It's an Ontario company. It's based in Toronto, and they acquired the sugar from El Salvador. We have maquila companies like Gildan Sportwears that are also based in El Salvador, produced sportswears for the international market, but it's a company based in Montreal. So there are many interests that I think that as Canadians that are maybe interested in El Salvador can start looking at as targets of denouncing, the engagement of Canadian businesses in the Canadian government in El Salvador. And it is unfortunate that the Canadian government has chosen to support the government of Bukele. I was sharing with a group of organizations in Canada that support El Salvador recently, that the Bukele government has, the Canadian embassy was very proudly announcing very recently the inauguration of a cultural center with IMAX technology, Canadian IMAX technology in El Salvador. And it is a cultural center operated by the Salvadorian government, by the Ministry of Culture, and it's the investments of Canadians that are doing this. But as Samuel said, why don't we tie the bilateral help of Canada to El Salvador to a human rights agenda and stop supporting a dictator that we know, as has been described by the previous speakers, is committing crimes against humanity in El Salvador. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Pedro.
Can we give one more round of applause to the panelists, please? And yeah, I think everyone would agree that was an extremely informative panel. And thank you to the panelists for their expertise and personal courage and bravery. And so while I'm conscious of the time here, we do want to allow for a bit of Q&A. In order to ask a question, we need to do it into this mic so that people online can hear. Maybe we could start with 2 questions. Please keep your questions very brief if possible so we can have as many people participate as possible. And since there is a large panel, if you could direct your question to a specific panelist if possible, I think that would be helpful. So I see a question here. Do you want to go up to the mic? Sure.
Hi, thank you so much. Leslie, I'll direct my question to you, but anybody's welcome to jump in. My question is that living in Canada, I found it really difficult to even access our members of parliament. I don't know what's going on, like in the UK and other countries with parliamentary democracy, it is actually possible to talk to your MP. My question is that what advice do you have for us to be able to actually build a movement here, just the way that you're doing over there, to get this message to them that Canada is, implicit in all of these things that are happening?
Thank you. Leslie, since that was directed to you, maybe you could respond briefly, if possible.
Yes, I mean, I would recommend educational work forums like this, but visiting El Salvador to hear testimonies, because I think that's very powerful, sharing people's stories. And then, of course, congressional and work with your government to convey your concerns about these grave human rights abuses in the prisons, in the mass arrests with no due process, and these mass trials. So, I think, as Pedro and Samuel mentioned, tie that to any aid or approval of any loans, that they have certain steps to guarantee due process and respect for human rights. So I think that's, visiting El Salvador, talking to people, information. I spoke at a church in Kansas City, and half the members of the church were Salvadorans and Mexicans, and they love Bukele, like people are saying. I gave a 50 show, and afterwards people came up and apologized and said, we didn't know. People don't know because as people have mentioned, Bukele has a very strong propaganda machine. There is a sense of security. I don't know if it's a real security, but for tourists and Salvadorans that visit, before the families say, oh, you can't go out, don't do this, don't do that. Now they say, oh, they have money, they go to the beach, the tourist areas are safe, which they always were too, by the way. But, I think it's important to let people know that not everything that glitters is gold, and that there's another side of the coin, and that security does not have to be based on grave violations of human rights.
Thank you.
And that's false security, in my opinion.
Any other questions?
If you look at a newspaper called El Faro, it's an online magazine that has covered that a number of times. There's also another Spanish, Salvadorian online magazine called Gato Encerrado that I know for a fact I have covered a couple of stories where Bukele's family has been the beneficiaries of some shady deals in terms of allocation of permits and land transfers. And there is another news paper or news magazine called Factum, Factum, that also, it's the most, El Faro has both English and Spanish. Gato Encerrado and Factum have only Spanish, but now with AI technology, it's very easy to find stories in English and Spanish and usually translate them into English.
Well, I would, just acknowledge that, yes, it's safer because Salvadorans they couldn't go visit their relatives if they were in a community controlled by the opposite gang, and that it's positive security, but innocent people shouldn't have to pay the price for that. There's no reason that a security policy has to be based on grave violations of human rights. And it's easy to prove. I mean, people have documented, Samuel has showed how the thousands of documents, how they have proved their innocence because there's a suspension of presumption of innocence. And that that's sowing seeds for, an explosion along the line, because it's making families poorer. It's disintegrating the families. We're not getting into the whole economic analysis that Pedro touched on, but the poor people are getting poorer in El Salvador. Yeah, you can go and see the great historic center with Christmas trees, but they displaced thousands of working families from the historic center. Not only the informal workers, but people that paid taxes, that paid for posts. They were the regime is also, nobody mentioned this, but it's also used against vendors and business people. Thousands of people were given notice that they had 72 hours to abandon their business, or they would the regime would be applied, not only in the historic center, but other cities where we work. In Distrito Italia, 168 businesses got a notice. They had 72 hours to leave their business, or the regime would be accepted. Bus drivers or bus company owners, when Bukele declared a week of free bus rides to cover up other project that collapsed, his road that he's building, the bus drivers that didn't comply because they're not paid, they're never paid by the government, were arrested. And one of those owners of the bus company died in prison, and one died later on. And so, to talk about that, I think, not in your face, but to try to talk about these stories and some of these realities when you can. And, I think a lot of them are out there on the internet. So to try to share those. And I just wanted to add to your other question of recent things in English. Al Jazeera just did a piece. It came out about a week ago. And that's in English. Univision just did, this is in Spanish, the two faces of Bukele. And Univision has been blocked now in El Salvador. And HIPES, GIPES, they are the international human rights experts, did a report. It's in English and Spanish about crimes against humanity in El Salvador. And then there was also a Frontline show, you can look all this up on the internet, that's in English, about the deal between, I don't remember the name, but it was about the deal of Secot between Trump and Bukele. So there's resources out there, and trying to share them, I think, is another way with your family members and the Salvadoran community to see the other side of the coin.
Thank you.
I'm sure we could keep going. Unfortunately, we're at time. We're past 9 o'clock. I encourage people to mingle a little bit if you can. But before we go, could we please give a shout out to Anna, who's been doing an incredible job translating. I'm sorry we didn't have more time for discussion in our formal part of the evening, but if you have questions or comments for the organizers, you can contact us through these emails. And like I said, people are welcome to stick around for a little bit. I see the food is out, so yes, and don't forget to return your headsets in the corner. Thanks again. Thank you.